All right, does everyone see this? Are we, just give me a quick chat if this is
Yes.
Yep, okay. Awesome. So we'll try to do this in 20 minutes and then have a few minutes for discussions at the end. So we are here to cancel the apocalypse, and we're here to try to reduce the total amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 1 billion tons over the next few years. So the first one, just to level set with everyone who's on the call about where we are as a species and as a planet. We have known about climate change as a problem for about 50 years. We have done not much for about 50 years. And similar to a kid who's refused to do his homework until it's due tomorrow morning, we are now at the crunch time. We have literally 7 years and 8 months left before we blow past what's called the carbon budget, which is the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can have in the atmosphere if we want to maintain a stable temperature. And literally by the end of this decade, we will have decided the direction of planetary climate change for the next 100 to 200 years. So this is something that our descendants, our grandchildren will be looking back upon us to see if we did well or we epically failed. So what is the scope and state of the problem? Well, this is a picture from the IPCC. This is the world's best summary right now of the different models we have available. And this blue line is actually the current policy scenario. So this is what we are shooting towards if nothing else changes dramatically. And this is where 2 degrees is. If we want to stay underneath 2 degrees, this is sort of where we have to go in terms of emissions year on year. And then this is where we have to go if we want to have emissions reduce, to stay underneath 1.5 degrees. Like, to give you a sense of like this sort of these curves, right? The last time in the last 50 years of human history, the industrial human history, that carbon emissions have actually decreased by any meaningful amount was the global financial crisis. And it decreased by 10%. So this particular thing, this particular sort of decrease is 50%. So not only are we going to have to decrease by 50%, but we're going to have to sustain the decrease by 50% if we want to have any reasonable chance of getting there. So just to give you some numbers, right, we're going to be talking about billions of tons of carbon. That's like the unit that we have to deal with when we think about this problem. For 2 degrees, we're looking at having to decrease it by 15 billion tons of carbon every year in terms of annual emissions. And by 1.5 degrees, we have to reduce it by 32 billion tons of carbon for sustainable outputs. So that's pretty high order, right? Even at the title of the talk, that we're going to try to reduce it by 1 billion through our own project. That actually is only 3% of the total requirements that we have to do by each year. So why is there any chance that we think this is possible? Well, I would argue that as of 2019, right before coronavirus hit the world, we actually had arrived at something like a tipping point for global awareness. So both at a grassroots level, the millennials, young people, symbolized by, I think, Greta and her friends, have really taken this stage and made it clear that this is something that is going to be a top policy priority issue for them. On the institutional and sort of, older generation crowd, we've seen announcements made by heads of very large companies and also by very large asset allocators to actually fundamentally rewire their particular approach to climate as well. So I think that we have, the awareness now. We have to figure out, what we're going to do. So I just want to first share with you a particular personal experience I've had actually going to COP25 in December and actually being there when Greta showed up and led a 500,000 people march through the cities of Madrid. So the little green arrow there in the picture is actually me sitting all the way in the back when she was doing like a press conference. And the key takeaway I had from attending COP25 is that the people of the world are ready to do something serious about climate change. The people who are actually fundamentally holding us back are not actually the individuals, but actually um, the politicians and the people who have vested interest. And the reason for that is because they have something to lose. The rest of us, we have more to lose actually from the failure of our ability to address climate change than we have from actually spending money to do it. So while Greta was leading this march, the other really important thing that was happening at the last COP was actually the negotiations around Article 6. And so Article 6 is probably one of the most important parts of the Paris Agreement. So when all of the countries of the world signed the Paris Agreement, they committed to actually each of them independently, reporting how much they were going to reduce of emissions, and then being able to meet their targets and being audited or verified by people along the way. So this is a global picture of a map of all the people who've actually signed on to the Paris Agreement, and conspicuously, everyone except Syria, Nicaragua, and the United States are signed on, right? But the challenge is actually, how do you actually incentivize all these countries to, take dramatic actions? And so Article 6 is the key sort of underpinnings of this entire structure, because Article 6 basically talks about the way that countries that do meet their targets ahead of time can actually allow their emission reductions to be used by countries that have failed to do so. And basically, it is the rules and regulation around creating a global carbon market. So I'll send the article into the group chat later. You guys can read about what Article 6 actually means. But I just want to share with you how actually carbon markets work, because I think these are some of the most important, capitalistic driven mechanisms, in the sense that there's actually real money being involved and real money being saved, and simultaneously also effective tools for addressing the climate problem. So in a nutshell, there's actually two types of carbon markets globally. There's what's called a voluntary market and what's called a compliance market. The compliance markets are actually when a nation state or a sovereign body decides that they're going to put a cap on how much carbon that they can emit. And if you as a company exceed your cap, you need to go and purchase additional credits to be able to meet your cap. Otherwise, the government will fine you, right? To give you a sense of numbers, the European government currently has credits that are worth about $25 for purchase, and a fine of $100 per ton if you fail to comply. So it is definitely in your interest to comply, and the compliance rate in the European carbon market is actually around 99%, right? And the numbers are actually pretty big. For those of you who are not so familiar, the total trading volume of the carbon markets in Europe in 2019 was actually $181 billion, right? So it's actually not a small number. And people project that it's going to be $1 trillion actually by the end of this decade, because that's actually what the market price of carbon needs to be for us to have effective climate action. Then in the countries and places in the world where the government has not gotten around to actually passing a national carbon cap and trade law, there's what's called a voluntary market. And the voluntary market basically is a market that is run mostly by NGOs, and it is the market participants are companies and individuals who desire to offset their own environmental footprints, but they do that as an action that they take on their own without actually outside forcing. So these voluntary markets and compliance markets, I personally believe, are fundamental to how we're going to actually be able to solve anything related to this global problem. And just to give you a picture of where these markets are today, the largest one I mentioned actually is in Europe. The compliance market in Europe is probably 90% of all compliance markets globally. There are small pockets of bright spots in California and also in the northern New England area. And they are sort of the second largest compliance market today. And then there's the beginnings of experiments that want to do compliance markets in these other countries. China, very excitingly, has actually publicly announced that they're going to build their own compliance market. And originally was going to launch at the end of this year, 2020. But because of Corona, I think it might launch at the beginning of next year, 2021. But when China does launch it, it actually will become probably the largest market in the world because China represents 30% of global emissions. So just to give you a number and a sort of evolution of these markets over time, in 2005 is when Europe started. And Europe basically put 40% of their emissions underneath the compliance requirements. And they have been the bedrock, actually, this blue bar, right, over the last 10, 15 years about the sort of market design. Now, these little green areas here are actually individual cities of China being added as pilots to this program, right? So you can tell how big these cities are in China that are actually emitting carbon. And this purple thing actually is the addition of the China's utility grids. So just literally by these additions, this market has grown from 5% of global coverage of carbon emissions now to 14% once the China's presence has kicked off. In terms of numbers, Europe actually has about $40 billion that is the market cap, and then the transaction value about $180 billion. California has a market cap about $5 billion and the transaction value of around 20 billion. So it's literally like 1/8 of the size of the European market. And then there's China. So that's kind of where we are today. Now, I want to take a step back and actually think about what can we do as people and as individuals to actually effectively participate, right? Because the crazy number that I've heard talking to experts in this field is that the total number of individual participants in carbon markets, either compliance or voluntary, is probably less than 100,000 globally. Like, that is not a lot of people. Like, it's probably less than, you know, the people who will at some point, you know, hear of these talks that we're doing right now. So how do we increase this number to something close to, you know, to something more reasonable? Let's say like, you know, 10 million people. Or if we actually want to actually have a real meaningful impact on this thing, we probably need to push it to 100 million people. If 100 million people start participating in the carbon markets globally, I think that actually we will start to see pretty significant reorientations of global economy. Now, the crazy thing is that actually we have successfully found a thing that allows global participants in things that have exchanges of value and also that have transacted trillions of dollars already. And that thing is the crypto world. So the crypto world, just to give you a sense of scale, Coinbase has hit 30 million users today. And BitMEX has transacted not $1 billion, but $1 trillion worth of value in 2019. Binance actually has operations in something like 100 countries. There's 100 countries worth of people who have actually signed on to have a cryptocurrency account with Binance. Like, in some ways, this actually is fundamentally the global technology that is already existing and has been funded by speculative market efforts. But so far, they have not been used effectively to actually address a real problem. So this is my summary of what's happened in the crypto world. We've had about, 11 years or so of market evolution. We have huge amounts of technology that's been developed to build global exchanges. And we've had successful demonstrations that we can transact trillions of dollars of value. What we don't have is actually any real reason why anyone who doesn't already own Bitcoin should care about Bitcoin. In fact, most people who have heard about the space have actually been disappointed or disillusioned because they feel like it's actually just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. So the question I have is, what problem do we have that's global, urgent, tied to individual behavior, mass mobilized, and market driven that this technology can be used for? And the thesis is that it is the climate problem.
Come on.
So I'm just going to give you a few little tidbits of what's happening right now. The first is that the World Bank actually has started to build their own climate blockchain repository. And what they want to do is they want to create a place where people can actually put some of the projects that they're currently working on in a system that actually people can interact with. So this pilot project happened last year at the World Bank, and we already see like companies connecting to it. So in Chile, the national Chilean government has actually initiated a connection to the World Bank's blockchain repository to be able to transact these carbon credits. And philosophically, there's actually a really interesting alignment between the way that the Paris Agreement has been structured and the way the blockchain works. Because the Paris Agreement is actually the second attempt at an international agreement. The first one was called the Kyoto Protocol. And the problem with the Kyoto Protocol was that it was a centralized process by which one particular international body would be able to tell governments and countries, you've done a terrible job. And that unfortunately did not sit well with many heads of state. So a lot of people did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, including the United States, and that really made the Kyoto Protocol lose a lot of its luster. The only people who really took the Kyoto Protocol seriously was Europe. And it's because Europe already had the experience of individual nation states answering to the greater whole of the European Commission. Now, the way that they built the Paris Agreement is actually very different. It's called a decentralized approach. So instead of having a rule dictator that tells each particular country what they need to do, the Paris Agreement actually asked countries to commit to their own targets, to describe their own nationally determined contribution. And as a result, they will be held accountable to their own words. And based off of this is what I just mentioned earlier called Article 6, which then allows the countries to trade amongst themselves in decentralized bilateral cooperative approaches in order to satisfy their national determined contributions. So I don't have too much time, but I just want to give you a taste of where I think this is going. The first is that there are actually a significant amount of technological and PR limitations to awareness, right? Frankly, none of you guys actually on this call, I think, with the exception of a few people, have actually thought much about carbon markets previous to this. And you guys are very highly educated, well-informed, and pretty, responsible citizens of the world. So we need to actually radically increase the total number of people who have heard about this and who want to participate. And the second is there's minimal retail participation or access. In fact, I just mentioned earlier, there's probably less than 100,000 people who've actually decided to offset their own personal footprint, let alone talk about actually what they can do for the global world. So the thing I'm going to work on over the next few years of my life is actually to try to address these problems using the techniques that we've already found effective in the crypto world. So the thing we're going to call it Carbonbase as a reference actually to Coinbase, which is the US's most successful Bitcoin exchange. And Coinbase has 30 million customers today. If we can get 30 million people to actually care about carbon offset emissions and reducing their own footprint, then we will actually have become a double-digit percentage of the entire voluntary market globally, which is kind of crazy. I mean, like literally, like it's the scale of the current world is so small, it's staggering. And then on top of that, what's really interesting is because these carbon credits, in the compliance side, are actually created by the government, and there's a fixed supply of them every year. If individuals start owning these offsets, it means that the companies can't own those offsets. Own those credits, which means that we can actually compete with the companies that are polluting for the number of compliance credits out there. And every credit that you and I buy and we hold is a credit that Coca-Cola or the steel factory in Poland can't use. And literally, this is a way for individuals to drive up the price of carbon emissions that makes it imperative for companies actually to take effective action. So right now, this is how the oil lobby has actually worked historically. They have a huge vested interest in government subsidies for fossil fuels, and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying the government, and then the government gives them back billions of dollars in subsidies. Like literally is a 10x multiple on investment. It's much better than private equity or venture capital investments. So what we want to do is we want to actually have vested popular interest. We want individual people to actually have a chance to not only participate in the climate change solution, but also to make money doing it. And so how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing I've been thinking a lot about is actually the advantage that we have given to us as a gift by COVID-19. So all of us are staying at home, and all of us are basically online, and none of us are really doing much, in our free time. So there is actually a huge latent internet audience waiting to be open to and being entertained by the ideas that we can actually solve our climate problem ourselves, like as people. And Lady Gaga hosted this incredible conference called Together at Home a few weeks ago, and she was able to motivate like 30, 40 celebrities who also had nothing better to do to come online and actually listen to and perform for people. So my idea is actually to host a benefit concert similar to Together at Home, but instead of having people pay tickets, we actually are going to encourage people to have to prove that they've actually purchased the carbon offsets as their tickets. If you want to come and listen to the global benefit concert, you need to actually put your money where your mouth is and actually choose to offset your own personal footprint. And the reason that this is actually possible is actually what blockchain has enabled, because the blockchain, especially these public chains like Ethereum, have actually given us a universal public ledger where any person can check, what is written on there for free. So if we start writing people's contribution to carbon offsets on this ledger, then we actually have a real way to easily check for any participating company, sponsor, that this is something that this person has done. And the second thing is that the crypto world has given us an international medium of exchange. We can actually literally now trade between individuals, between one country to another, without having to pay any middleman except one single website. And that actually is fundamentally powerful. It's just been very underutilized. So I'm just going to skip ahead here. This is a diagram we've designed that we think can be a map of how we want to do this. So we have 3 parts to it. We have the first part, which is the individual coming and being able to purchase an offset. And we want to make that as easy, as simple as possible for anyone who wants to do that. And this is already in the works. The second is we want them to commit the actions of people buying this to the blockchain and have the blockchain be our source of truth of who has offset how much carbon. And then the third is we want to create an ecosystem where other people out there are incentivized to reward those individuals who have offset their footprint. So I'll give you a very simple example. There's a company out there called Decentralized, which is actually making a giant VR world, right? How cool would it be if every time you've actually offset a ton of carbon, Decentraland planted a virtual tree with your name on it in big letters that then you can visit and it will exist there for perpetuity. Like literally we can give every single individual a virtual tree, and the cost of creating these trees to Decentraland is basically $0 because it's in the digital realm. So my personal belief is that there's actually a sort of virtuous loop that's possible to make, where we have individuals committing to their personal offset footprint as responsible citizens, then triggering the companies to also care about offsetting their own footprint. And then third, to actually create this like sort of globally connected, tokenized carbon offset world where everyone actually can look at how much each person has done and then give them the necessary social standing or social kudos and social value that they deserve. So that's the end. I'm just going to finish on this particular point, which I think is pretty incredible. Like, there are several things happening that are going to rewrite the way that global climate finance looks like. The first I mentioned already is that the China launch of the market is going to be happening imminently. And this, coupled with the fact that China just also announced their national blockchain network, makes me think that there's actually going to be a really cool linkage between these two systems. The second is actually a wealth transition, right? So young people today are not really at the heart of decision making yet, but over the next 10 years, people estimate there's going to be $60 trillion of wealth that are going to be transitioned from the elder generation of the baby boomers over to the millennials. $60 trillion. That's so much money. That money, if actually precisely directed, can actually effectively finance all of climate transition, even up to the crazy ambitious goals we have. So it's there. The money is definitely there. The third is that actually the European Union has launched the Green New Deal, which is the Europeans' commitment to actually financing climate initiatives. And hopefully we're going to see other countries launch their own Green New Deals. So that's all for time I have, unfortunately. I just want to highlight to you guys that what we do this decade is going to write the history of the world. And so we can have a story that is epically inspirational for other people, that we actually managed to do something, or we can have a story that is an epic failure, where we basically saw it coming, we had the tools to fix it, and we didn't do anything. If you guys want to talk to me or hear anything else, I'll leave my email in this chat. And thank you guys so much for your time. Really looking forward to hearing from you guys. If you're a moderator, can we unmute people and see if anyone wants to say anything? How do I unmute you guys? Yeah, I'm taking questions.
Hey, Max. I'm curious, what's the mechanism of the offset? So I work in this space, and there's tree planting, there's development projects. I'm curious, like, if you're baking that in, or if you're leaving that up to the individuals or corporations that are part of this.
So we are going to work with Goat Standard, Vera, and any other registry out there that actually has really solid, vetting processes. And we also want to radically increase the total number of people out there who can verify the sort of projects themselves. Because I personally believe that, like, really right now we're only creating on the voluntary side 50 million tons of credits a year. That's nowhere near enough. And then on the compliance side, the governments are minting them. So, we see all of the projects that have passed Gold Standard and Vera review as eligible. And in the future, we also want to put in actual carbon sequestration projects as well. But yeah, I think the compliance model of actually making sure that any sort of offset project is real and does exist and is actually high quality is really imperative for us.
Great, I'll reach out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate your time, and good luck to the next speaker as well. Cheers. Okay, it seems like the next speaker is actually missing. So we're gonna just take this time until the guy comes to just have a regular talk. It's kind of free flow on conference style. And I really appreciate all the people who've responded in the chat. So it's really your time here to talk. Maybe Jenna, you want to go first, or just share what you're thinking about, or how you're working on this space?
Whoops, sorry, I was on mute. So, hi, I'm
Yeah.
Jenna. I'm a strategist. I work a lot in communications and kind of like ways to get people on board to environmental projects and tech projects like what you're up to. So this is super up my alley. I'm working right now to set up an org that does offsetting through ecosystem restoration. So that's, including tree planting, but it's also kind of looking at the ecosystem holistically, right? And we are setting up our first kind of site in Uganda right now. 56% of Uganda used to be forest. Now we're looking at 6%. And the conversion is, $1 equals 10 trees in 5 years of maintenance, right? So there's just a lot of opportunity to kind of rebuild what was lost there, and kind of, when you rebuild an ecosystem, you're not just rebuilding an ecosystem, you're also helping everyone who is a part of that, right? So yeah, really curious about what you're up to. Have you looked into what Alipay has been doing around tree planting and kind of gamifying tree planting? And I'm curious what you think about that specific initiative, just given your research in the area in order to put together something like this.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually going to send you guys an email thread and attach this business case that someone wrote about Ali Forest in particular. So for those of you guys who don't know, Ali Forest actually has signed 500 million people over the last 5 years, all of them mostly Chinese citizens, to incentivize them to use daily behaviors to actually, do, climate positive actions. And so far, Ali has spent about $80 million and planted 100 million trees, which is just insane, right? Like when people say that like we can't actually have like planetary scale engagement, and Forest actually showing us that you can definitely have it. The challenge that Alipay, in my view, is that one, Alibaba is actually putting all the money in. So thankfully, they have a leadership that actually is open-minded enough to think that this is something that's worth doing. And two, it only works in China. And three, it only works in RMB. And there's actually no way for people actually to put money into Ali Forest. The only people doing it are actually the corporation themselves. So what we want to do, we see our chance of doing actually is to try to take the model of Ali Forest and actually build a global model for it, right? And have the individuals participate economically instead of one giant corporation, so that every one person has stake onto the forest that is being built.
Sweet. I'll send you an email about this. We'll talk.
Awesome. Akash, I know that you're on the line. I don't know if you're still on the line. I know you're working on sustainability.
Hey, Max.
You want to say anything?
I'm here. Yeah, I would love to use this time to sort of learn more about the markets and like how they work for individuals. But I can also introduce myself quickly.
Please.
Yeah, I am an engineer turned sustainability consultant whose sort of main job is to use research analysis to decipher complexity. And I've done this across different roles. And I've got this extreme sense of urgency to act on climate issues and inequality, because I feel like those two are increasingly interconnected. So that's something that I've been thinking about and exploring how that could happen. And so far, my challenge is that getting people to sign up on anything requires some sort of change in consciousness. And that is a very psychological hurdle, because people deny things that are too big. And so how do you change that on an individual level? How do I make people better humans, and through that inspire them for climate action? I think this is sort of the line that I've been thinking along. So yeah, if anybody would like to talk about it, or yeah, that'd be great. And I guess regarding the carbon markets question, I've been wondering how do individuals sort of trade these certificates? How do they interact with the corporations? And like, what challenges do you see within this, Max? From I don't know much about carbon markets, but from studying them 2-3 years ago, I realized that, as you correctly pointed out, the pricing of credit or a permit is the most tricky thing that limits action for many companies.
Yeah. So I just want to share with you a thought, which is that there's not enough incentives today for people to care about climate, right? Unfortunately, the people who do care are people on this call, and the people who don't care are the rest of the people out in the world, because they have other pressing, urgent things to do. So my vision for this really is we need to dramatically incentivize those people with things that themselves, the rewards, can't produce more emissions. Like, so this is why we have to be digital. Like, we have to create digital rewards that are basically free or marginally zero carbon to scale, that also have significant value. And I don't know if you guys have watched this movie, Ready Player One. Ready Player One is, like a blockbuster, basically showed the upcoming world of virtual reality. And the cool thing about Ready Player One is that the experiences you can have in Ready Player One have zero carbon footprint, right? To actually make and drive a Ferrari costs a lot of carbon, but to actually make a digital experience driving a Ferrari is basically zero. And so we think about the way that we can actually give the gift of those people around us a far more, rich experience. It's actually mostly about how do we give those other people, like people in developing markets of the world, a chance to experience the pleasures that we have taken for granted without actually producing more carbon. And I think that's actually part of the design process, right? And so that's one whole track. The other whole track is we just need to get buy-in from the ways that traditional media is disseminated. Like there is not enough positive, actionable news on any media around what people can do for climate change. And I think that's going to increase a lot. Yeah. I actually apologize. I'm going to have to go. I'll call in on my phone into this chat so that I'll still be here, but I just won't physically be on this camera. But again, thank you guys so much for listening and your attention and your thoughtfulness. I hope to start a continuous chat over email with all the people who are curious about this, and look forward to hearing from some of you guys in person. And also, yeah. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Max.
Since this is a conference, I wanted to take this opportunity to ask if there's anyone who wanted to discuss something in the room before the next session. Something related to climate. Right.
Sure. I'd love to toss out a conversation starter, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name's Harrison. I'm a mechanical engineer and designer interested in sustainability. I think one of the big challenges that I've been thinking about is what are ways that we can see moving forward of decoupling economic growth from carbon consumption. A lot of people, when they think about regulation and the carbon credits, we can drive up the demand for carbon credits, but in what ways does that quote unquote slow down the economy, and in what ways can we restructure the ways that we produce and work such that the economy can grow while our carbon output decreases?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, Harrison. So FYI, I actually know Max, which is why I didn't share too much earlier. But right before this session, Max and I had a conversation, and I was sharing with Max about how one of the research that I was working on at the Stanford Research Center called 0 Degree Project was looking at temperature of capital. Like, how can we start, like you said, the decoupling of that? That involves, for me, like equating, or including temperature in capital, because, like for example, some economic activities could cause growth, but it's not, but it's actually heating the planet too. So that we would say, like, okay, this money is actually heating the planet by X amount. Or we could say, like, actually, because this person did some innovation on how they're conducting their economic activity, we can actually say that they are cooling their planet with their economic activity. Happy to share more, but just starting that seed for now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a cool concept. Temperature of economy. I've never heard of that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, since you're an engineer, there are definitely thoughts like school of thoughts in the economic field that looks to modeling like even things like physical, like, so I can't remember what they are called, but definitely thermodynamics is something that we're looking at. Sometimes I joke about calling it thermodynamics economics. This is actually like an established school of thought. What I feel that is missing sometimes is including the social factor in the temperature, because for me and the team that I was working with, it's not just a physical phenomenon. Like, temperature didn't just happen. Like, there's a lot of important conditions that determine whether it goes up or down. And one thing that I wanted to continue more conversation with Max about is about not just focusing on carbon, but like it's a good start. So and I would also personally like empathize with like the direction that I see your question going, being ultimately, like I'm trying to do more research into how can we have more of a, if you will, like a priceless system, where we're not trying to convert what is invaluable, like nature, into like price units. But I do believe that we need a transition step towards that. Although sometimes I hope that we can just do that. So yeah, something that, yeah, I'm looking at.
Thank you. I don't know how much time we have until the next speaker talks. Could you, I don't know who's a moderator, but could someone give an idea of how much time we have to chat? 10 minutes, okay, cool.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to take Akash questions, unless you have a question, Harrison. Like, okay, so when I say priceless transaction, I mean looking at how kidney exchange market works, where you actually first outlaw price in that market because of the inherent first principle that life is invaluable. And so like making environment invaluable too, but using much more sophisticated matching algorithms to match offers and needs in the market. And there's a lot more to say about this. Like, I guess for people in the crypto space, something that I am interested in is not just undirected, directed acyclical graph, but also looking at, is it possible to have probabilistic, like non-deterministic graphs that can allow for, yeah, basically things to be matched in a much more efficient way.
Hello. Oh.
So roughly like the world's most advanced trade and barter system?
Kind of, yeah, sounds amazing.
Well, go on.
I was wondering, like, this is something me and my colleagues have been discussing over the last few weeks. And we've been talking about how, like, for our economy to work, or like for people to live, we basically need like some kind of basic resources and some purchasing power to kind of, live the life we want to live. But then when we think of how we participate in the market, when we are born, we have to subscribe to the dollar, and the dollar comes with its own power because some people own a lot of dollars and some people don't. And when I say own a lot of dollars, it means that they have ownership of a lot of assets that are able to produce things. So one thing that I've been also thinking about is how can we change credit or the way we do transactions so that they capture not only just like the tradable price, but also other aspects. For example, I just said nature is invaluable. But then the challenge I kind of come towards is how do we sort of, use the resources which we do not have ownership of? Because to be honest, like convincing the people who have ownership of those assets is like a big task, and we've been trying to do that. And if that would have been successful, I think the oil companies would have changed their stance much more long ago. So yeah, I wondered, what are your thoughts on this? Like, would you say that how could this become like the norm? I know it's like a very early question, you're on a research stage, but just like if you were to speak your heart out.
Sure, I can try. So how I would like to see this happen is that for us to start recognizing that like with the money that you have, for example, if you're an oil and gas company, it actually is heating. So what I mean by that is like we start recognizing different source of power. Like in the past, we don't have that. We don't know that, oh, like this money is equivalent to that money. But the truth is that there are sources of power that are destructive to life, and there are sources of power that I hope like individuals start taking it up, like what Max say, that you can actually innovate on things that you own, that you can then prove an impact that, hey, because of my innovation in my economy activity today, I've harnessed like a new cooling power that it's orders of magnitude better than even if it's $10 compared to the oil and gas money. So like what this means for me is like not just leveling the playing field, but also to be honest, to make existing power lose power.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. Do you have any like resources where I could like follow it up more? Anything published online on temperature economics?
Well, this is extremely not updated, but zerodegree.stanford.edu was a site that we created a long time ago. Now, yeah, why don't like we should all hop on the email thread with Max, because I think I can share more stuff there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
River, I saw that you have a question too. Do you think that was addressed already or not?
Hi, sorry, I'm just kind of jumping in last minute. So you probably may have addressed it before I jumped in, but I'm actually just about to post a seminar I listened to recently from the Long Now Foundation out in California called, spoken by a lady who wrote a book called The Value of Everything, Mariana Mazzucato. And she has a really interesting talk and book about how we rethink just the basic value of economies. And it certainly highlights the example you were talking about with organs as well. So I'll just post that in. I think that might be a resource you guys might appreciate.
Yeah, and if you just join, maybe if you want to leave your email so that we might be able to add you to an email thread.
Oh yeah, please, sure. I don't like email, but sure, let's do it. More green time, less screen time, but we'll get there. Thank you, thank you.
I literally asked the same thing because we were Facebook messaging and I was telling him like, I'm sorry for my like non-responsiveness when it comes to messages. Like calls are better.
calls are way better. Voice calls are way better. Like my thumbs are the least expressive part of my body. And they're really slow input points. You know, speaking of order of magnitude, it's just ridiculous. But anyway, we will get there. But yeah, I'd love to share some resources around this.
I've also been thinking, like everyone has a different understanding of what the real problem is. And from like a 2-year interdisciplinary course on sustainability science, I've come to realize that everything is so interconnected. Like if I choose to explore more into that, I'll come out in the world as a non-expert, but I would be more of a, like a systems expert, maybe. Like I know how things are interconnected, but I'm curious to know like what everyone thinks is the root cause of the problem. Like I know maybe some thoughts that you have, Vienna, on like the transaction pricing, but just like, you know, to kind of have this conversation, would everyone would want to kind of say a few lines on it? And let me know like if it wasn't clear, like I can like for me, I'd say the root cause of every problem in the world is the way there's the expectation of a return on credit, and that when that incentive, when it's put in different contexts, either in an organization, corporate, or you know, as individuals, it kind of creates individual benefits on the short term and not on the long term. And nature works on a long term time frame, and we can't really bring that back in. And this is also visible in the stock market. So that this is something that I believe, and I feel like that creates inequality, and that in fact creates a lot of high climate impacts for the people who have a lot of purchasing power, and high climate impacts for people who have a lot less purchasing power, because then they kind of literally destroy forests to survive. So yeah, I'd love to hear somebody else's thoughts.
I can share. Okay. So I just shared warm data labs because what you brought up is something so important, because the thing that we often don't recognize is even in our conversation here, we have so many trans-contextual like information coming together. Like what I mean by that is like, not only are we separated in geography, but it also like what kind of time scale, like, and like what story to what story. Like this is something that, like you say, like the market does pretty well right now, like, because they have really sophisticated financial instruments to me, what is most important here is time at play. Like they have very sophisticated instruments to do that. Like, and a very central part of my research often has to do with temporalities. Like this is just a example of trans-contextual information. But there's so much I could say about this. But like yesterday, we had an experiment of like warm data lab in a room where people were just sharing a story that is not the cold data, like, you know, hey, my name is this, but more like an information of what brought you here to the room. And even just that simple question, you can see that the answer that people give, like, you know, range all across the board, from like what time scale, like they're sharing, like is it like, you know, their mom, thanks to their mom that they're here, or like is it, you know, thanks to someone who saved their life yesterday, like, you know, that all that. So, but those are all integrated part of the data that gets us here in this room. But there's just no way of understanding that right now. So what I mean by using more sophisticated like matching algorithms also involve like understanding relational data. And sorry, I feel a bit like, wow, there's so much to say, and I know that, you know, we're late already, so maybe I'll just get there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah.